In Chapter 85, on the hunt for some pocket money to buy a very expensive video game, Gon came into contact with an object that commanded his attention. That object was a knife made by one of the most prolific nen geniuses of a long-forgotten generation. But unfortunately, genius does not always equate to good. This is the story of Benny Delon, a nen serial killer who terrorized the world of Hunter x Hunter over a century ago, and a man whose legacy of evil still lives on to this very day, trapped within 288 objects. Benny Delon was an exceptional swordsmith who lived over 100 years ago, who has historically been described as follows. A swordsmith by trade, he forged a numbered knife each time he killed someone as a memento. He made 288 in all. He put the knives up for sale in his storefront with his regular swords and knives. In prison, he was said to have explained, "Each of my victims' screams and facial expressions inspired my work." He had a cult following even in his day. And there's a wide array of reasons for Benny Delon's cult following. One reason has to do with nen and the fact that these knives are imbued with some very grotesque aura, which don't worry, we'll get into. But that's not the most common reason. Most people in the Hunter x Hunter world are completely unaware of nen, but there's a colossal market for the practice of body part collecting and body part collecting accessories that come along with it. The most notable example of this would be the scarlet eyes of the Kurta clan. They're very bright, very pretty, and most importantly represent a horrendous act that a lot of the underworld elite seem to take quite a bit of pleasure in harboring. A lot of them have a strong desire and curiosity for morbidity. For example, another highly sought after collectible item is the skin of a patient who contracted Dracoderma, which morphs a patient's skin into these lizard-like scales, which is something that does actually exist in reality to some extent, although Hunter x Hunter takes this idea to the next level. And my personal theory regarding this condition is that it's a consequence of yet another unsuccessful, undocumented Dark Continent voyage, because there's been a lot of them, so many, and we still know frighteningly few of the curses that were brought back. In any case, the fascination behind Ben knives is the artistic expression of pain, anguish, despair, and all of the other bad words that occur when a person is being mercilessly killed. To be clear, the knives themselves were not what was used to kill the victims. In fact, we have no evidence of a Ben knife ever having been responsible for a death, even though they probably have been. But these knives were created as an artistic response to Benny's killing, to capture that moment in time of absolute suffering endured by the victim. So each piece is a portrait of a murder to those looking upon them. Portrait may not be quite the right word, because these knives can also serve as fun interactive art, and even an invitation to participate in further art, because there's a lot of these blades floating around in the world. 288 victims is an insane amount of life loss and damage done, which, to put into some perspective, if Benny killed one person a week, then it would take him over 5 years of consistent injections of weekly murder to produce this count, although it's more likely that it was a bit more spread out than that, primarily to not draw attention to oneself. But even if Benny murdered once a month, that would take 24 years of activity, and the evidence suggests that something along that rate is more likely. Benny spent years cultivating his abilities, and you can find a whole host of cultivation stories with the sponsor of today's video web novel, and quite specifically what I've been reading recently, Myriad Parts of the Dragon Emperor. It's a cultivation novel, a genre of Chinese fantasy heavily inspired by Taoism, Chinese alchemy, and best of all, martial arts. And in this case, our protagonist Lu Ming has his precious blood meridian stolen by the love of his life, Liu Yao. Not a very nice thing to do, Liu Yao. However, Lu Ming is then reborn with a supreme blood meridian, allowing him to learn divine techniques such as the True War Dragon, which when cultivated to its highest level is said to be unparalleled. But of course, doing that is not quite as easy as it sounds. All you need to do to read this bad boy is download the web novel app through my link in the description and search for Myriad Parts of the Dragon Emperor, and you're there. Plus, you can read a whole ton of other great novels and even comics. And I also wanted to say a huge thanks to Web Novel for sponsoring this video, all of which goes directly to funding our wonderful channel artists and editors. But it's also just a great app with great stories and incredibly easy to use. So give Web Novel a go. But for now, it's back to you, me. When the Zoldycks were hired to kill Chrollo during York New City, the Phantom Troop leader came into battle wielding a Ben knife, which Silver Zoldyck was able to identify as a quote mid-era Ben knife, and one that specialized in poisoning enemies, which tells us a couple of things, none of them particularly good. The first is that Benny Delon, unfortunately for the world, had such a long and vast career that his works can be divided into at least 3 eras: beginning, mid, and late era knives, with each period having its own distinct identity based on Benny's interests and artistic evolution at the time. And it also implies that the knives may have been given a specialty depending on how the victim who inspired the knife was killed, because the fact that Benny made knives and swords does imply your classic, stabby style of murder, but the victims could have been killed in countless numbers of ways. ways. So because the Ben knife that Crawler uses specializes in poison delivery, then perhaps that particular victim was killed by poisoning. And really, look, Benny made 288 of these, and he had to keep himself interested somehow. You can't just stab everyone to death, you're going to come up with the same shaped knife. So I imagine that Benny was on an ongoing quest to kill people in new ways to attain new inspiration to create new knives. And in that case, the early era knives may represent the most basic forms of killing and suffering, then the mid-era knives get a bit more complicated, and then perhaps the late era knives are just brazenly sadistic and really push the boundaries of human imagination, also known as the Saw effect. Because that's art, and that's why artists are traditionally some of the most troubled people in a society. A lot of the time, works now worth millions and hanging on the walls in the halls of billionaires were created by practically homeless artists desperately trying to paint away their own personal demons. With that said, the value of a Ben knife is very questionable. When Gon and Killua discovered one at an open-air auction, Killua said that the knives are undervalued due to DeLonge's notoriety as a serial killer, but they're masterpieces that underground collectors are very keen on, with the lowest sale value being 5 million Jenny, or over $300,000 US. So publicly, they're basically garbage that can be picked up for, I don't know, a couple of Jenny, but privately, they can be quite highly sought after. The knives aren't just hoarded by collectors either. They're actually still put to use by professional assassins and assorted other professions that involve killing. And this is because the knives are imbued with a particularly sinister brand of aura. One thing that I should make clear before we get into this is that Benny DeLonge was not a conscious Nen user. What he was a Nen genius, meaning that he used aura unconsciously. When Wink first starts properly explaining Nen, he states that very few people know of Nen, let alone actually utilize it. And those that do tend to occupy a place in history as a famous painter, sportsman, politician, musician, leader, etc. Any individual who rises above the riff-raff and beyond to greatness in this world was probably an unconscious Nen user. As well as religious icons like Jesus. Jesus is mentioned in Hunter x Hunter, and he was probably a Nen user. But a great non-Jesus example would be Komugi, the unbeatable Gungi player who was so driven that, without knowing, made a Nen vow to kill herself should she ever lose a single game of Gungi. So by putting her life on the line with each and every game, Komugi was able to exponentially multiply her Gungi skills due to Nen, all unconsciously. And in the case of Benny DeLonge, he conducted a similar practice just spread out across 288 knives. Each time he killed one of his victims, Ben would be struck by the emotions they presented whilst dying. So struck that he meticulously incorporated that experience into his art, forging all sorts of twisted, horrific knives that don't just visually portray the experience of the victim, but contain imbued aura to allow Benny to feel the experience again. And as a side effect of this, the knives became imbued with a sort of permanent version of Shu, which is the imbuement of objects with aura as an extension of one's body, thus making them tougher and more powersome. And that's also why the Ben knives haven't weathered or aged to this very day, and are still some of the most potent weapons any killer could hope to wield 100 years later. It's unknown how long these knives are likely to remain in peak condition, but a century of time has done absolutely nothing to them. And I would argue that these knives could live on in near perfection for potentially a millennia, maybe even more. And that's purely because of the connection between Nen and emotion. Using the concept of Shu was actually a bad example, because that's a more impartial use of aura. It's very mathematical and academic, which Benny DeLonge was not doing at all. The aura control that Mr. Benny mustered was 100% linked to emotion, which is the most potent form of aura control. Aura responds to feelings, desire, and sacrifice. And scarily enough, these 288 knives have all three. The initial sacrifice of the victim, the feeling of their death, and the desire to incorporate that into a knife. So the truth is that it's probably a lot deeper than just the basic or advanced principles of Nen. And when it comes to Nen geniuses, it's always difficult to ascertain their affinity because they don't know they're Nen users, so they don't take tests. But from what we know, they tend to be specialists, which is very appropriate because without classic instruction in aura control, they already fall out of the bounds of the established system. So specialization is a great home for these unique individuals. However, that means that whatever Benny was doing with these knives and his victims could be an off-the-chart specialist hatsu. And the reason why that should send cold shivers down your fragile spine is because that implies that Benny could have been incorporating his victims into his art beyond the simple physical plane. He could genuinely be taking a piece of his victim's life force, their aura, and committing the Nen equivalent of the murder that he's already literally committing. He's taking their lives, and during that process, he holds on to a little piece of their aura, which Benny can feel within him, that pain and anguish guiding and prompting the process of the knife's construction, and ultimately sealing the aura he stole within it so that his work can live on forever. It's genuinely sickening. The idea of taking the victim's aura and then mixing it with the killer's aura, trapping these two entities in an eternal replay of that horrific event. But speaking of living on, some of you very clever people will probably have picked up on this by now, but there's one more absolutely game-changing factor that influences these knives, and that is post-mortem Nen, which in very simple terms is the idea of Nen becoming more powerful after death, because the feelings, desires, and potentially even sacrifice whilst living resulted in an enduring force of aura lingering in the world. And with the Ben knives, there's not just one, but potentially two sources of post-mortem Nen. You've got the victim, who Benny deliberately works to produce the strongest emotions possible, and then you've also got Benny himself, who is now dead. So it's no wonder that a Nen rookie like Gon was called to a Ben knife, because the aura quantity within them might be quite small in comparison to all of the big flashy techniques of Hunter x Hunter, but the feeling behind it is one of the strongest and most enduring that we've ever come across. That knife is approximately 100 years old, and it is still persistently screaming as loud as it possibly can. And to really emphasize the true terror and potential of Benny Delon, we are lucky, or lucky probably poor choice of words, but we do have an example of someone very similar to Benny in the modern day, which would of course be the fourth prince of the Karkin Empire, Soraidnik Huygo, another Nen genius and art enthusiast who describes his work as follows. If I'm skinning pigs and monkeys, it's just dissection. What I seek is art, produced by youth with a future put in an extreme situation, a synthesis of the arts. And what he means by that is seeing the response of taking that future away whilst he's brutally murdering them, which is part of the inspiration for his Hatsu parallel future, which directly allows Soraidnik to select the future and take that potential away from those around him. But if he and Benny were born in the same era, then I think that they would be quite scarily on the same wavelength. The main difference in process being that Soraidnik makes his works out of the remains of the people he kills, although this could even have a more potent effect than Benny's practice, because as a Nen genius, Soraidnik could be inserting aura into a post-mortem being. The main issue is that even that kind of talk is far too small scale for where Soraidnik is in the series currently. What's happening now is much more scary, because the best thing that ever happened to the world a century ago is that Benny Delon never discovered conscious Nen use. If he did, then the 288 victim count would only be the prologue to his CV. And right now, 4th Prince Soraidnik is showing what Benny could have become if he was formally taught Nen. You know, I wouldn't be surprised if Soraidnik himself owned a collection of Ben knives and was even inspired by his work. It's quite a terrifying legacy to leave, and that's why the Hunter Association is so strict with its requirements of who gets taught Nen. Because if one of these sadistic geniuses does manage to slip through, then it could go on to define the pain and suffering of an entire generation. So that is the legacy of Benny Delon, the most notorious Nen serial killer in Hunter x Hunter for now.